Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for tuning in, and thank you so much for having me. Um, Coming to you from Boulder, Colorado, 6:30 in the morning here. So today I'm going to talk about labs in general and their proliferation in North America, especially, and I will finish up by talking about my own lab, the Media-Archeology Lab. It's hard not to notice the proliferation of labs in the arts and humanities in North America over the last 10 years. These labs now number in the thousands, and they can be anything from physical spaces for hands on learning and research to nothing more than a name for an idea or a group of people with similar research ideas. And they have no need for physical space and really no interest in taking on infrastructural thinking through shared physical space. The proliferation of these labs reflects a sea change in how the humanities are trying to move away from the 19th century model of academic work that's typified by the single lone scholar who works in the boundaries of a self contained office and within the confines of their discipline to produce usually a single authored book that promotes a clearly defined set of ideas. Instead, humanities scholars seem to be rallying around the term lab, along with innovation, interdisciplinarity, and collaboration. These are all terms that are invoked when labs come up. And I think this is likely because the idea of a lab helps scholars put into better focus their desires for a mode of knowledge production that's appropriate to the 21st century, what one might call post humanities, after Rosie Braidotti's use of the term. For me, in more concrete terms, this version of humanities works means pursuing modes of knowledge production that are responsive, conversational or dialogic, emergent, collaborative, as well as transparent and self conscious in recording the knowledge production process and experimental about what constitutes a knowledge production and distribution process. These are all perhaps by now tired cliches of the kind of work that many of us would like to do and that many administrators would like to see humanists do. But it's still worth noting that probably because of a long-standing uh, lack of access to resources rather than a lack of imagination, very few humanists are actually able to do this kind of work. So, this trend to create labs, even if only in name, is also a response to pressures humanists are feeling to both legitimize and sometimes even pre legitimize what they do, as increasingly they're expected not just to perform, but more importantly, to prove they're performing. The proof of performance is possibly now more important than the performance itself. And where else do we get our ideas about proof but from some notion of how the sciences are in the business of proving the rightness and wrongness of theories about reality by way of the so called discovery of facts that takes place in a laboratory environment? It's true that some humanities labs appropriate a traditional notion of labs from the sciences, and they do so under the auspices of innovation. The Stanford Literary Lab, when it was under the directorship of Franco Moretti, is the most well known example of this, as Moretti described the lab's main project of distant reading as one driven by the desire for in his words, more rational literary history. Because quantitative research, he says, provides a type of data which ideally is independent of interpretations. But this example aside, what does a uniquely humanities lab look like? Or what could a lab look like if it didn't feel compelled to respond to pressures to perform and objectively measure this performance? How could a lab even creatively make the most of its more limited access to resources that large science labs depend on? And how could this humanities lab instead embrace what I've just called the post humanities? The lab book, Situated Practices in Media Studies, which is coming out from the University of Minnesota Press, hopefully in spring, and was co-written between myself, UC Perica, and Darren Worschler. This book investigates the history as well as the contemporary landscape of humanities-based media labs in terms of situated practices. Part of the book's documentation of the explosion of labs in the West over the last decade or so includes a body of over 60 interview directors and denizens. And the interviews not only reveal a really profound variability in terms of labs driving philosophy, their funding structures, infrastructure, administration, and outputs, but these interviews also clearly demonstrate how many of these labs are trying to pursue 21st century humanities objectives. And they do it in a mode that openly both acknowledges and carefully situates research process as well as its products, the role of collaboration, and the influence of physical and virtual infrastructure. While outside of higher education, a lab can now refer to anything from a line of men's grooming products to a department store display or even a company that's dedicated to psychometric tracking. Across the arts and humanities, this term lab still has tremendous untapped potential to capture an array of methodically delineated and self-consciously documented entities for experimentation and collaboration that always include an emphasis on doing or hands-on work of some kind. I've also viewed the lab book as an opportunity to position the medie-archeology lab, what I call the MAL, this is the lab that I run, in the contemporary landscape of these humanities media labs. Since 2009, when I founded the MAL, the lab has become known for how it undoes many assumptions about what labs should be and what they should do. Unlike labs that are structured hierarchically and driven by a single person with a single vision, the MAL takes many shapes. It is an archive for original works of early digital art and literature, along with their original platforms. It is also an apparatus which we come to understand a complex history of media and the consequences of that history. It's also a site for artistic interventions, experiments, and projects. It's also a fluid, flexible space for students and faculty from a range of disciplines to undertake practice-based research. It's a means by which graduate students come for hands-on training in fields ranging from digital humanities, literary studies, media studies, museum studies, to community outreach and education. In other words, the MAL is a place where, depending on your approach, you can find opportunities for research and teaching in many different configurations, as well as a host of other less clearly defined activities that's made possible by a collection that is both object and tool. The MAL has a collection that's both full of objects and tools. And my hope is that the MAL can stand as a unique humanities lab that's not interested in scientificity, the way Franco Moretti was talking about the Stanford Literary Lab, but that instead it's interested in experiments with rethinking history and reimagining the future, and in experiments also with lab infrastructure in general. So the MAL is now, in 2020, a place for hands-on experimental teaching, research, artistic practice, and training using one of the largest collections in America of still functioning media from the late 19th century through the early 2000s. This, the first image that I'm showing you, this is the one side of the front room of the lab. You can see in the image, starting from the far left, we have a TRS-80. Moving all the way to the far right is an SGI Indy that hosted a bulletin board system in New York City, and lots of interesting machines in between. And this is the opposite side of the room with the, laptops, portables, luggables, as well as our Apple collection. We have a substantial printed matter collection. We have a substantial typewriter collection. This image actually doesn't only captures about half of the typewriters that we have, and a lot of other analog media, magic lanterns, mimeograph machines, stenographs, all kinds of things. The MAL initially came to life in 2008, 2009 as the Archaeological Media Lab. And at that time, the field of medie-archeology had not yet become known in North America, and the lab was really nothing more than a room on the campus of the University of Colorado at Boulder. And at that time, it just contained 15 Apple IIe computers, floppy drives, and copies on 5.25-inch floppy disks of a work that I'd come to admire very much called First Screening. And this piece was one of the first digital kinetic poems, and it was created by a Canadian poet by the name of B.P. Nicol. There is the image of the Apple IIe computer that we used to view this work. And this is an image of the manuscript version of the floppy or of First Screening. I began the lab then partly because I wanted to start experimenting with stockpiling hardware and software as a complementary preservationist strategy to creating emulations like the one of First Screening that had recently been made available. This is back in 2008. Without really being aware of the very nascent debates in archivist communities that were at that time pitting emulation against original hardware and software, I wanted to just augment students and scholars' access to early works of digital literature and art while also collecting other works on their original platforms in order to eventually make available emulations of these works. However, I also created the lab because I wanted to bring in classes to work directly on the machines, work directly with the original work by B.P. Nicol, rather than only study the emulated version. In other words, the lab allowed me to think through with students the difference the original material, tactile environment makes to our understanding of First Screening. It was a straightforward enough experiment, but even now in 2020, the implications of this kind of literary historical work are, I think, far-reaching and unsettling to the discipline. First, this approach involves moving away from close reading and from studying literary products, and instead it involves turning towards studying the literary production process, looking at how a literary work was made and how the author pushed up against the limits and possibilities of particular writing media. The ramifications of such an approach start to become more obvious as soon as one realizes that learning and teaching the how of literary production depends on having access to particular tools in a hands-on lab environment. That said, while using hands-on work as the driving force behind teaching and research is quite new to the humanities, the process-oriented approach to interpreting literature has been around in one form or another since the early 20th century, or maybe even earlier. As many people are fond of pointing out, nearly all foundational media studies scholars in the West, this is from Walter Benjamin to Marshall McLuhan to Frederick Kittler, were first literary scholars. Moreover, one can read the long history of experimental writers, especially poets, as one that's inherently about experimenting with writing media, whether it's pens, pencils, paper, or typewriters and personal computers. Since my academic background is in 20th century experimental poetry and poetics, the move to exploring the materiality of an early digital poetry was a logical next step. Furthermore, once my attention turned to the intertwinement of First Screening with the Apple IIe computer, it made sense to me to add to the lab's collection other comparable early personal computers from the 1980s, like the Commodore 64. And this was at least partly to get a sense of why B.P. Nicol might have chosen to spend almost $1,400 in 1982 on the Apple IIe rather than the $595 Commodore 64. And the answer is probably in the fact that the Apple IIe was one of the first so-called affordable computers to include uppercase and lowercase letters, along with an 80-column screen. And the Commodore 64 only had a 40-column display and uppercase letters only. So the Commodore 64 was great for gaming, but not so great for literary production. So in these early years of the lab, I tried to sell it to the larger public by saying that it was an entity for supporting a locavore approach to sustaining digital literature. This is a pitch I also hoped justified our very modest online presence, while also underscoring the necessity of working directly with the machines in the lab rather than accessing, say, an Apple IIe or Commodore 64 emulator online. And so from 2009 until 2012, the Archaeological Media Lab maintained its modest collection of early digital literature and hardware software from the early 80s and gradually increased its network of supporters, which ranged from eBay sellers who had become ardent supporters of the lab to students and faculty from disciplines ranging from computer science, art, film studies, English literature to digital archivists. However, 2012 was a turning point for the lab for a number of reasons. First and most importantly, the lab was given probably a 1,200 square foot space in the basement of a 1940s house on the edge of campus. It does not sound glamorous, and it's not glamorous, but it's a significant change to the single room in a cottage that we had before. So this space really made it possible for the lab to become the open-ended experimental place that it is today, with a collection of still functioning media. I don't know off the top of my head how many devices we have, but I know in our new website that we're in the process of launching, we have nearly 3,000 items in our catalog. Now, an item can be a piece of software and it can be a book, but we certainly have probably 300 functioning pieces of hardware. So the other thing that happened in 2012 was that I renamed the lab the Media-Archeology Lab to better align it with the field of media archaeology that I was then immersed in. And the third thing that happened was that the MAL became a community enterprise, no longer just synonymous with me. So in the early years, the lab was really all about me and my research interests, and happily in 2012, that really shifted. And now the lab has an international advisory board of scholars, archivists, and entrepreneurs, which I consult. It has faculty fellows from across the university campus, and it has a regularly rotating cohort of undergraduate interns, graduate research assistants, affiliates, and volunteers from all public. So it's become a really large community of enthusiasts. The lab is also now a kind of anti-museum museum. I think when you first walk into the door of the lab, it's easy to assume that it is a museum of the history of computing, but I really don't think that it is, because, again, all of our devices, analog and digital, ranging from the 1880s up to the early 2000s, all of them work, and they're meant to be turned on and actively played with, opened up, tinkered with, experimented with, created with, and moved around and juxtaposed next to any other device. So the MAL is particularly strong in its collection of personal computers and gaming consoles from the mid 1970s through the 1990s, ranging from the Altair 8800B, which I have a lovely image of, the complete line of Apple desktop computers, from an Apple I replica to models from the early 2000s. We have a desktop from Sweden, East Germany, and we have a Canon Cat computer and game consoles like the Magnavox Odyssey, video sports and television, Atari 2600, Vectrex, and NES, and many other Nintendo devices. So these are just a handful of examples of the hundreds of machines in the Mal collection, in addition to thousands of pieces of software, magazines, books, and manuals on computing from the 1950s to the present, as well as the aforementioned analog media we house from the 19th and 20th century. In the video that's going to be screened after my talk, you will see the manager of the MAL. Her name is Libby Striegel. She's going to give you a brief tour of the lab, after which she's going to demonstrate the lab setup for wireless or over-the-air transmission. She's also going to demonstrate the digital poem first screening that I talked about earlier, as well as the lab's Vectrex and our one laptop per child computer. Anyway, to return to my talk, what I'm trying to say today is that the MAL is essential for exploring the functionality of historically important media objects. And it's functionality that cannot be understood in any depth if one only has access to, say, promotional material or archival documents. And it's access that fundamentally shapes one's understanding of the media object's place in the history of technology. Put another way, the lab invites one to reread media history in terms of non-teleological series of media phenomena, or ruptures, as people in media-archaeology are fond of saying. And all of this as a way to avoid reinstating a media history that tends toward narratives of progress and generally ignores neglected, failed, or just obsolete media. I was going to say dead, but I think obsolete is the right term. As I mentioned earlier, too, I've really come to see the MAL as a kind of variantological. This is a term that Siegfried Zielinski uses. It's a variantological space in its own right. It's a place where you can find all kinds of opportunities for research and teaching in pretty much any configuration or combination that you like. And it's also become a really crucial space for professionalization for graduate students. So at the same time that a new PhD program here at the University of Colorado came up and was founded partly by me and partly by Mark America, called the Intermediate Arts Writing Performance Program, we put the MAL and another lab called the Techne Lab at the heart of this PhD program. And in the last 5 years or so, the lab's vitality has grown substantially because of the role of these PhD students who have developed their own unique career trajectories in and through the lab. And I think the results have been quite extraordinary. One student created a hands-on archive of scanners in conjunction with a dissertation chapter on the connections between the technical affordances of scanners and online digital archives. Another student founded an event series called Malfunctions, which pairs nationally and internationally recognized artists with critics on topics related to the MAL collection. This same student also arranged residencies at the lab for these visiting artists and critics, who in turn generated technical reports on their time spent in the lab. Furthermore, as a result of her work with this event series, this student has been invited to be a curator for annual media arts festivals, local museums, and galleries. And yet another student, this is a new student who arrived this year from Serbia. She has started a podcast on the MAL that's called Malcast, and it's going to be launched early in 2021. And finally, when MAL manager Libby Striegel was a PhD student, she hosted monthly retro game nights targeted specifically for members of the LGBTQ community at CU. And she also ran monthly workshops teaching students and members of the public how to fix vintage computers and games consoles, as well as basics of computer security and privacy. So, in sum, the MAL is unique for quite a few reasons. Rather than being hierarchical and classificatory in a very particular way in its display of objects as well as administration, the MAL is porous, it's open to anyone. It's flat, it has a flat administrative structure, and it's also branching. Objects in the lab are organized in any way participants want, and again, everything is functional and meant to be turned on. Rather than setting out to adhere to specific outcomes and 5-year plans, we change from semester to semester and year to year, depending on who's spending time in the lab. Also, rather than being an entity you need to apply to be a part of, again, anyone can participate in the lab and have a say about what kinds of projects we take on and what kinds of work we do. And I have just a few images of people in the lab because it can be very easy to represent the lab as only being about objects, but it's really people using the objects that's most important. And what you're seeing here is a class of undergraduate students playing with typewriters for the first time in their lives. And here are some students playing with the Vectrex game console, which you're going to see a demo of shortly in the video. Rather than being about the display of precious objects, whereby you only ever get a sense of the external appearance or even external functionality of the objects, we encourage people to play, tinker, open things up, and even take them apart. Rather than perpetuating a neat historical narrative about how things come to be, we encourage an experimental approach to time. We put Edison phonograph discs beside contemporary proprietary software. And it's probably hard to see in the image that I'm showing you, but on every single one of these Edison phonograph discs from 1912 or 1913, there's a large, extensive warning to not try playing these discs on the competitor of the time, which was the Victor Victrola. Or we put the Vectrex and its light pen up next to a contemporary tablet and stylus to see what we can learn through the juxtapositions. And finally, rather than participating in the process of erasing the knowledge production process or perpetuating the illusion of a separation between those who work in the lab and the machines they work on, and trying to hide the agency of the machines as well as the agency of the larger infrastructure of the lab, we're interested in constantly situating anything and everything we do in the lab and trying to be self-conscious and descriptive about the minute particularities of the production process for any projects we undertake. This is another reason why we've launched these technical reports. So in short, and in closing, it's my hope that the MAL can be a tool for moving away from traditional humanities work and is tentatively model what post-humanities work might look like in the 21st century. And thank you so much, everyone, for listening and tuning in.
When you first walk into the media-archaeology lab, you'll notice a lot of stuff. The first room is our computer lab, and is home to a wide array of personal computing devices, successful and otherwise. Dating back as far as 1976 and as recently as 2012. The bulk of our collection comes from the mid-'80s, though. Our portable and luggable devices mostly live on a shelving unit in the corner. And our software collection lives on the shelves above the computer desks. And tucked in and around all of the devices in little stacks, usually formed based on what was used most recently or what gets used most often. We keep our electronic literature and software art collection separate from the games and productivity and design software, primarily for its protection, but also as a way to highlight those things as an exploration of the limits of software and hardware for students and other guests. It's one of these pieces, First Screening, from BP Nickel, that'll run for you now. This piece was written for the Apple IIe computer, and that's what you're seeing a direct video output from. Our front room also houses one of our sub-collections, a group of devices left in our care by the artist Jamie Allen after his residency. They are classified by him as apocryphal technologies, and include devices that make readings of the physical world and extrapolate proclamations about the metaphysical or psychological. They include a pair of lie detectors, a love meter, and a pair of Scientology e-meters. When you step out of the front room and go down the hallway to the southwest, you end up in our small library. This space houses magazines, manuals, zines, ephemera of all sorts, history texts, design explorations, coffee table books, early theorizing on the relationships between humans and computers, and more or less practical guides for interacting with devices and those who've mastered them. Proceeding through the building to the southeast, you'll find yourself in the back room, which houses most of the rest of our display collection. To the northwest, our word processors and typewriters. To the northeast, our audio listening devices, including one of the oldest pieces in our collection, the Edison diamond disc phonograph from 1913. It's currently being repaired, but you can see its parts. Much of our collection requires this sort of regular repair and maintenance. Continuing through the room to the south, you'll see our telephone, mobile, palm top, and wearable collection on the west wall. This collection includes early e-readers, a proto-smartphone, the progenitor of Google Glass, modems, fax machines, even a switchboard from East Berlin. On the east wall, we have a jumble of mostly analog technologies, primarily of the image-making and viewing variety like projectors and cameras, though we also have a variety of office and library tech, including adding machines, dictaphones, and mimeographs. At the south end of the room lives our video game and educational technology collection. We have a decent selection of early education devices like the Speak and Spell and the Speak and Math. We also have a range of video game consoles and handheld devices, as well as crossover systems like the Atari 400 that tried to capture both the video game console market and the personal computing market. Our video game consoles range from recognizable pop culture icons like the Atari 2600 and the various Nintendos and Segas, to the less familiar now, though quite popular in their time, like the Mattel Intellivision, the massively common in countries outside the United States, like the Nintendo Famicom, and the unfamiliar and obscure, like the Casio Loopy and the Vectrex. And the Vectrex is really a fascinating stubby branch on the evolutionary tree of video gaming. Its vector display is a scaled-down version of those common in arcade cabinets. The direct screen interaction made possible with the light pen was years ahead of its time in a home device, and looking at it is a fully different visual experience than you get from a roster display. It's gained popularity over the many years since it went out of production as a device to modify and write new programs for, or to port other programs to. There are dozens of homebrew games, short animations, and musical performances for it. Many of them are collected on these multiple program cartridges like this one here. In addition to our video game collection, this back area houses the heart of our growing over-the-air broadcast capabilities in the form of our short-range TV transmitter. With this, we can broadcast both VHF and UHF signals to our collection of televisions. We mostly use our VHS player as the output device, though we can also transmit a live feed from a camcorder or output from our various game consoles. Thinking about over-air transmission and networking is one of our burgeoning areas of interest, not only in terms of television and radio broadcasting, but also two-way communications like ham and packet radio networks, Bluetooth and shortwave radio direct and mesh networking between computers, slow scan television, and so on. One of the devices we've spent the most time thinking about along these lines is the one laptop per child laptop, the notoriety of which has overshadowed one of its very real advantages, the forefronted ability to create ad hoc mesh networks and do collaborative work between devices in almost every program its standard operating system offers. The OLPC is one of those right device, wrong problem situations. Exploring them offers the opportunity to envision an alternative present where our communications are decentralized and direct rather than mediated through siloed corporate interests. Most of our collection offers that opportunity, though, if we find the right angle of approach. To give a quick peek behind the curtain, this is our side room, where devices await repair or are stored until we need to replace something currently on display. And the final stop on our tour, this is our upstairs space where our newest acquisitions are being cataloged and tested, and where we always have something more to explore.